let's open up to the floor. I've got, if I could just, a few notes of housekeeping before. Before you say your question, could you state what organisation you're from? And do remember to speak clearly into the microphone. Thanks very much. Over here first.
Thanks. I'm Simon Burrell. I'm Director of Involve and also former ODI. I just wanted to kind of pick up on Sarah's note that people feel, I think it was Sarah rather than Lenny, saying that people feel manipulated. I just wanted to kind of reflect on that, because I don't think that what we need is just communications experts. I think we also need public engagement experts, because in the end this isn't just about messaging to the public to bring the public with us. This is actually about as much about our change as it is about the public's change. So I'm just interested in how you think that you can begin to do that, because the costs and benefits, there are a set of trade-offs. So trade-offs between what we do here versus there, if we want to think of it in those terms. But also when we are doing aid, there's a set of trade-offs. India versus Ethiopia, schools versus health, whole sets of trade-offs. Unless we're engaging the public in those things, they won't trust us, and actually support will continue to fall. So how do we bring the public with us and change ourselves at the same time?
I'm doing one question at a time. Or?
Yeah, one question at a time, yeah.
Do you want,
okay, we could say something and then maybe come in.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to I mean, I completely agree. I think Simon probably should be sitting up here. I think this is definitely about more than communications. And I suppose, I mean, when I say we need to bring the public with us, I think that needs to be understood in quite a deep way. This is not about sort of convincing the public to like something that we think that they really secretly don't like. This is actually about trying to fundamentally change the way we do things. And I think this question about how we engage people with the trade-offs, I think there's a tendency in the aid and development industry to not want to talk about when things go wrong. And I think all the points that have been made about this are very well put. You know, people know that this stuff isn't simple. They know that nothing is simple. You know, people understand that things go wrong in the NHS, things go wrong in education, things go wrong when you commission big infrastructure. The idea that you're going to sell them a story that actually when we're doing all those things in really difficult, complex environments in poor countries, nothing ever goes wrong, that's just not credible. And I think we just have to be a bit more realistic about people's level of understanding. You can't convince them that it's simple, so you might as well be honest about the trade-offs. And I think you're right that we need to come up with some much more innovative ways of trying to engage the public in those conversations. And obviously, as Ben said, this is a particularly hard ask for this area as opposed to others, because most of the public don't have direct engagement with that. So you don't have the sort of automatic engagement with those trade-offs that people get on domestic issues.
Maybe if I could just add, I think that one thing that we pointed to in our report, so there may also be opportunities here, because I think there is an opportunity to listen more, to consult better in this area. And into next year, when we have the G8 here in the UK, when we have a debate kicking off now about what the kind of next MDG framework, what a great opportunity to start trying to better listen, better engage our own citizens as well as citizens around the world in some of this, and making that as much a kind of two-way listening as well as thinking about how we communicate. So that's one of the things that we recommended in our report.
I would, just picking up on that, I would obviously agree with what was said, and also agree about the point that clearly it's not just a matter of communications. But on the point of engagement, I would emphasise the fact that engagement itself is actually a complex issue, and my suggestion again would be to look at that in a multi-dimensional sense. And the most important distinction there is between attitudinal engagement. So if you like, getting someone to buy into the ideas of a campaign or an organisation or even some sort of theory, and then behavioural engagement. And those two are often linked, but they're linked in quite a complicated way. And it's not just the case that if you get someone to engage behaviourally, you can get them to engage attitudinally, and vice versa. We're just to put in yet another plug. We're doing an absolutely enormous piece of work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation at the moment, which will look at precisely that, segmenting the entire population in terms of multidimensional engagement and defining audience groups based on that. And all I would advise is to watch this space, because I should be writing up the report at the moment, but instead I'm here. It will be coming out, and it will offer more information about that. But certainly for the time being, think about things in that multidimensional context.
Thanks. Can I take the next three questions, please? Can we have from this lady here first, and then from you, sir, next, and then from you, sir, next?
Hello, my name's Henry Fawcett. I'm an MSc student at LSE. So my question is a bit more about strategies. We've been talking a lot about how this information should influence information and communication strategies and now engagement strategies with the public. Interesting, some of the things that Spencer, Lenny and Ben have said, or things that Lenny and Joe have said relate to changes that we've seen in DFID recently, certainly under Andrew Mitchell. What I'm trying to say is that in DFID we've not only seen communication changes but also strategic changes that have responded to some of the things that you've mentioned in your surveys, accountability, killing off waste, more targeted intervention and information. So what I would like to know is, do you have any comments about how this public opinion is not only driving engagement strategies but also driving intervention strategies of NGOs and also of donors like DFID?
Hi, I'm Brendan Paddy. I'm the comms manager at the Disasters Emergency Committee. My question was prompted by something Lenny and Sarah were commenting on, but it's relevant to others as well, I think. I'm interested in spending more time trying to engage with donors and the public more widely about how aid actually works, the issues that you face in delivering aid, the challenges. I suppose my experience has been, although people will tell you that they want to know more, that isn't reflected in their behaviour. I wonder to what extent that was something that you were aware of and had come across in your research.
Hi, I'm Michael Green. I'm unaffiliated, but for 4 years I was head of communications at DFID and used to worry about the DFID polling from 2003 to 2007. And I mean, Joe, you're absolutely right. I mean, the DFID attitude polling generates absolutely no insight. The problem was it also generated no...
It wasn't done by us.
It wasn't. And it all not generate any publicity because it was just so boring, because basically nothing happened. Basically, public, if you said to the public, do you care about development? You do, don't you? 7 out of 10 would say yes. And that didn't change year by year. But I mean, the interesting thing is the way that in its final phase, before it got cancelled, it did start to show this change, a sort of drop-off in support for aid, which of course has nothing to do about the aid or development debate. It's about other exogenous factors about the state of the economy. So I think that's one thing to remember is like, what's driving these numbers? Not a lot, and other things. To generate some insight, I think we funded some polling about the Make Poverty History campaign, the Darnton study that some people may have read. And that was striking in the fact that it showed no change in public attitudes between February 2005 and February 2006. There was just a brief sort of spike in July 2005. So even that sort of massive campaign didn't do very much or anything that we could find from the polling to actually change public opinion. So there's a sort of, what's actually driving this is pretty hard, and I think these are pretty hard entrenched attitudes. We also did a bunch of focus groups, and they also told us that the public wanted to hear more about development and a more nuanced story. But on the whole, we just ruled that out, that basically if you lock people up in a room for a day, they have to justify having spent their time that way by saying, yes, I'm interested. So I would be cautious about saying that people want to hear more about development. They certainly don't want to read more policy papers. They don't want to discuss budget support. I think there is a point, however, about engagement. And I think Make Poverty History is a great case study of a campaign that treated the public very badly. It brought them in and then dumped them again and left them nowhere. And I think the future campaigning is the stuff that's actually going to engage people long term and actually give them something to do. But I think that raises its own challenges, because one of the most successful public campaigns about development in recent years has been #StopConey.
Thanks very much. So for the first question, would any changes to DFID's intervention strategy, who would like to take the first?
I mean, if the sort of question is public opinion as measured by surveys and so on, but probably also more realistically, public opinion as mediated, obviously, rather inadequately through the media, does that affect policy and practice? The answer is yes, it certainly does. I think so. I mean, at one level, that's what happens in a democratic society. At another level, the kind of undeniable upsurge of sort of more negative coverage recently has put pressure and put things in the spotlight in a way that they haven't been before. So I think it'd be naive to say otherwise, and you see all that manifested in all sorts of ways. And I think as NGOs, in part of that, I think we need to deal with that kind of we need to deal with that in a kind of grown-up way, I suppose. So at one level, I think, you know, I suppose when that started to happen a bit more, we're not used to that, and charities in general are not used to that. We're the good guys, and it's all kind of unquestioned. So in one sense, you know, of course, when you read a piece in the Telegraph saying, you know, British aid's going to, or I won't say the Telegraph, but there's definitely been in some, you know, it's going to the Indian space program, or all sorts of, or to Iceland, or all sorts of kind of blatant lies, basically. Absolutely, it makes you angry, and you need to respond. So there needs to be a rebuttal sort of strategy. I think we could have been better at doing that. I think we're thinking collectively, and we are looking and doing that now much more better at coordinating how we respond, and also getting on the front foot. So at one level, look, it's a debate, and we should grab that with two hands and engage in that debate and have the argument, because in some ways, where you don't have the argument played out, people can't get an insight. So there is a silver lining in some of this stuff that we've seen recently if we take that, and certainly as NGOs collectively, we are absolutely doing that in a sort of more kind of short-term rebuttal way, and we've got whole process to plan about how we get back on the front foot and do that. So I think, you know, we shouldn't get too crowded in terms of attitudes. You know, what pans through eventually into the long-term public attitudes is not always the same as read by the media. We need to distinguish those two. They both drive policy. I fear that actually the media piece very often drives it more than the public attitudes, and we need to be smart in terms of that. If I could say just another quick point on the engagement piece. I mean, I think this is absolutely right. It does need to be a two-way thing. I think, again, NGOs, you know, do listen to their publics and do listen to their supporter base. If they don't, they die. But I think there is a lot more we could do about what that debate is, and the sort of, it sounds a bit old-fashioned, but the kind of movement building. I mean, again, I think it's something we can be proud of as a kind of taken over a long period. You know, NGOs have put a lot into that and working to build and engage and a kind of, you know, a grassroots. Of course, in the digital age, that needs to look a different thing. It's not necessarily a drafty church hall, but we still need that, and we perhaps haven't done enough attention to supporting that. So those are just kind of a couple of comments on kind of a couple of points that needed. But debate is not always bad, you know.
I was just going to make a very quick point about DFID, and you shouldn't overestimate, but at the same time you shouldn't underestimate the impact that personnel changes have on the issues, and how that affects the lots of strategies involving how NGOs and others engage with them. We've gone from a situation recently where Andrew Mitchell and his special advisors, all of whom were very, were, I think on the record, very positive about international aid in jobs that they enjoyed, all leaving and being replaced by Justine Greening, who I think it is fair to say is not as positive. That is one way of putting it.
Yeah.
Sorry? I have suspicions.
Read the Daily Mail.
Yeah, and
don't always leave very soon.
and I would be happy to discuss them with you, Glenn, in more detail later. And so I think part of that strategy is that yes, you are viewed as the good guys, but at times you need to be prepared to fight hard and occasionally play dirty. Because you're up against people who are more than happy to play dirty, very dirty on occasions.
Has anyone got anything else they'd like to add on that subject?
Just two quick reflections, if I may. I mean, I think like Ben, I'd actually welcome the focus that we've seen on results and on communicating results from DFID. And I think, like Joe, I would agree there's lots of different factors that affect that, not least personalities. I think it did reflect a response to public opinion, but also to other political dynamics happening within current government and political parties in power. So there's lots of different reasons as to why that played out. I think what I would just point to in terms of our findings is that, in a way, what we were trying to say is that people seem to not just to want to know about the result and the outcome, but actually they want a bit more information about what happens along the way and how do we get there. So it's not necessarily the case that there's a real appetite for a lot more big numbers and figures of success. People actually, they want to understand a bit better how that success happens. And I think that's still where there is still scope and room to sort of shift for DFID some of how it's communicating on these issues. And just very quickly, I think in terms of our findings, I would definitely agree that when you sit people in a room for 3 hours, they all say, this is great and we'd love to know a lot more. And we definitely took that with a pinch of salt in terms of our findings. And actually what we recommend is not that people want to know a lot more and to fill their time with reading up and thinking about international development, but actually even in that very small window of opportunity that you have, there's a lot more that could be done to change the story that people are being told and that they perceive they're being told. And there's quite a lot of appetite for that. So I think there's that's the aspect about even in the moment where you've got a picture on the tube, where you've got an advert, where you've got a speech, really thinking about the messaging that goes into there is important, and that I think there is scope, in limited ways, even with new forms of social media, to be thinking a bit more deeply about engagement as well. But I think we would definitely accept that that's limited in terms of, your average citizen's appetite for that.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take 2 questions from online now. First of all, this is from Asta, an independent agricultural consultant. Is there any preference from the UK public about the type of aid people prefer, whether that be road construction, food, health, or anything else? And the second question from World Vision UK's Head of Supporter Experience, Milton Keynes. With regard to opinion on whether the government should increase overseas aid, does the opinion of donors differ from those who do not donate? Perhaps Spence would like to...
I've got stuff on that. You go first. Just on the specifics of types of aid, we've explored that in some depth, but we haven't gone down to the detail of should it be roads versus some alternative. As a more sort of general point, people much prefer the idea, and it's the old cliche which you hear in focus groups and qualitative research again and again and again, the idea of teaching a man to fish and you'll feed him for a lifetime and so on and so forth. We all know it, we've all heard it, and that is consistently presented as the more popular of the ways. Presenting aid in terms of partnerships, in terms of self-sustainability, those are viewed as the most positive options. And sorry, what was the other one?
It was, does the opinion of those who donate differ from those who don't with regards to how much the government should increase aid?
Yeah, and people who are more engaged, and that can be attitudinally or behaviourally, of which donating money is an example, are more positive about the government giving aid. Generally speaking, though, our most recent results show that it's probably more complicated than that. But it's still not the case that everyone who donates is massively supportive and everyone who doesn't is massively against it.
We've been struggling as to how to ask about different types of aid, because it's very difficult to ask somebody about basic budgetary support. We can talk about building schools, and building roads and all this sort of thing, and emergency assistance, etc. But it's very difficult to actually put together a question that asks something like about basic budgetary support, for example, those types of things that are less tangible, and so we've struggled with that. We haven't explored that yet. On the donations versus support for aid, we have found fairly strong connections, but I think you also have to be careful on the donations front. There's a big difference between people who are regular donors, are committed to donating, versus have that tin. Are they still made of tin? I don't know, but anyway, the tin that's sort of thrust in front of them, and someone wants to, and then you can put the badge on you, and then you won't be pestered again. They're very different. And you have to, I think so we found the very committed donors, the regular donors, tend to be very supportive of aid, okay? The others are a whole spectrum, so you have to be careful as to who you're talking about.
And you mentioned that age was the only demographic that made any difference.
Yes, it's a bit different if you start modelling values. I mean, because part of the problem in all of this, because it's all about statistics, and the methods you use, is the trouble is that a lot of the things you use to explain all vary with one another as well, and so you have a lot of problems statistically teasing out, the influence of one thing versus another. But we've struggled to find consistent demographic factors, certainly in terms of things like gender, for example, those sorts of things. Yeah.
very much. And now some more questions from the floor. Yeah, one from over here, one from the lady there, and one at the back.
Glenn Tarman from Bond. I just wanted to maybe build on some earlier points. One was Michael's point about May poverty history. I think one of the interesting things, as one of the people that put that together and delivered it, is that we weren't trying to change those polling results at all. We were trying to get some political outcomes, and we knew that that would mean politically to reach out to different groups of people, for young people to be inspired to be involved, for women to be involved, for different demographics to be involved in an election year and so on. So we weren't trying to do that. We were trying to get a result on Aid and Others, a result that will kind of pay dividends in the next few months. I think now we would definitely look back and just say political outcomes aren't the only thing that's important. The public engagement, the failure of us to sustain and inspire people to be involved for a number of years subsequent to that, and the kind of ways that we engage them around email actions. I mean, I led on that, I'm quite proud of it, but equally, it was a certain kind of action, or even in the broader landscape of the direct debit and the email your MP, that kind of smaller actions that we take. I think now we would definitely put public engagement and sustaining it as equal to the political priorities. And we are beginning to look, I think, in new ways about what engagement looks that's deeper, longer, and more meaningful across a set of things, whether it's voice and campaigning, whether it's resources that are more and giving, whether it's the relationships that people have, the expertise that they have, the behaviours that might be useful around whether it's food waste or climate change, and the other thing about their involvement in our organisations. You know, not just at the end of an email, but potentially more. And a lot of that we don't know what it looks like yet. But what's quite exciting is, because we haven't tried to do that in the way, you know, May Poverty History had a limited set of goals, and we got certainly outcomes that we were after. This time around, we've got a much more rounded opinion about what we want to achieve. And it's quite exciting to think that we've succeeded in a lot else that we've tried to do. And kind of going into next year and beyond, we've got lots of possibilities about inspiring the British public to be involved in whole new ways with whole new outcomes. And that's pretty exciting, and I think it's for all of us to kind of describe a little bit more about what it looks like and how we're going to make it happen.
Thanks very much. Over here.
Thanks, and thanks to the panel for your presentations. My name's Diane Sheard, I'm from the One Campaign, and thank you to Spencer for flagging up the research that we commissioned. We actually did it, just by a bit of background before I get to my question, we did it in the middle of the Daily Telegraph and the Sunday Telegraph's 4-week campaign against aid, and we found that some of the polling that they were reporting to be to use Joe's analogy, it just didn't sound right to us, so we wanted to unpack it and do some ourselves. And when we found that when you do explain to people exactly how much money you're talking about, 6 in 10 people support aid at the current levels, and 2 in 10 would actually increase it. We found, on your point, Joe, about questioning where statistics are from, and we found that we had to negotiate quite hard with ComRes on how to present the information in a way that I'm sure that the Daily Mail and the Telegraph don't have such strict concerns over how that data is used, but we really had to negotiate around the language in communicating our findings to make sure that ComRes were happy that we were keeping the robustness of the data while also trying to tell a narrative with it. One thing that we have done in addition on our website is to publish a tax calculator to bring together the points that you were making about pounds versus percent. If you go onto our website, find a tax calculator, you put in your gross annual income, and we will work out for you exactly how much of it in pound and percentage terms goes to defence, education, NHS, aid, servicing the national debt, and that kind of thing. And all of that tries to play into the idea that just giving people the basic information will try and dispel some of the myths. I just have a question really about where people find their information from, and maybe it's more for Sarah and Lenny. I just have a question really about where people get their information, and whether the statistical difference in age plays a part in that. And you know, obviously, an organisation like ours, One Campaign, does a lot of stuff on social media. We do a lot of stuff through our website. And I wonder if the access to information and the source of information differs depending on the age groups.
Thanks. And right at the back.
Thanks. I'm Jonathan. I work in media and public affairs here at ODI. I'm starting to wonder if it's a kind of reflection and a question, really. I'm starting to wonder if we should be thinking about this as a game of chess, in which we're playing the kind of the amorphous grandmaster of public opinion. Because I started thinking, do we need new arguments for aid and development? And then listening to Joe's presentation, you know, the idea that some white knight of an argument is going to ride to our rescue on this is crazy. You know, the pieces are on the board, and they always have been, the arguments for and against aid and development. And what we should be thinking is, at this moment in time, which are the best of our arguments to marshal, and how best do we present those? And I think if you look, for example, at debates which are taking place around the EU budget at the moment, you've got countries in the rest of the world like China, India, Brazil, the same size as the EU, all moving in the same direction. And you've got the European Union trying to put us in a position where the external action budget is less than the administration budget of the European Union. And actually, if you start to talk to people about the role of aid and development, not just as a financial transaction, but as part of Britain's relationship with other countries in the world, in a world that's changing very quickly, people may start to think differently. So my question really, particularly to Spencer and Joe, is do you have any understanding of how people see Britain's relationship with the rest of the world and how they see aid playing within that? Because to me, at the moment, in a rapidly changing world and an environment where we're faced with austerity, that's an angle that in this game of chess might get us a few moves ahead, maybe.
Fantastic. Do you want to start on that?
Okay, just picking up on where information comes from. Yes, we have a great deal of data on that. We ask people where they get their information from. Generally, we also get them ask them where they get their information specifically about aid issues and so on and so forth. What we find is that actually it's not surprising. The winner, if you like, is television by some distance, then newspapers, then radio. And those are, if you like, the three games in town. Yes, social media, the internet is important, and it's more important for young people, but it's nowhere near as important as television, radio, and newspapers. Not for the average person in the street, and the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street. And so, yes, new media, all very exciting, etc., but it's not a game changer at the moment. Now, that, of course, may change, and as we all have... as we all get tablets and so on and so forth, the situation may develop over time. But as it stands at the moment, it's still very much, if you like, as you were. With regards to Britain's relationship with the world and the impact that has on things, I mean, I think people have written PhDs about that. It is quite a complicated issue, to say the least. One of the things we did notice from some of our qualitative work was that in certain and this is sort of perhaps too specific a point, but in certain aspects there was a sort of ex-colonial, ex-empire feeling of guilt and responsibility. We know that that has an input for some people, but the degree to which that plays, I'm afraid I'm not familiar enough with those findings to say. So yeah, I would instead just pass the buck on that and say it's a complicated thing. It's definitely something we need to look at in more detail.
Would you like to add on that point?
I just wanted to come in with 2 points, one of which speaks to that. I think the important question in terms of the politics of this is what makes public opinion on aid salient at any given time. So, if you look back to the last Labour government, aid was an important part of a bigger narrative about social justice. It was part of a bigger narrative about Britain's place in the world, which speaks to your point. And obviously, the current government and the Conservative Party in particular, aid is playing a different part in that narrative. So it was the aid commitment was an important part of a political narrative for them at a time when they were trying to change the image of the party. And now all the stuff about cutting waste and achieving results is part of a much bigger narrative about fiscal responsibility. And I think it's worth all of us thinking about, there are some quite complicated mechanisms by which public opinion and political salience are related. And that's partly about the underlying public opinion, and it's partly about contemporary politics, and it's partly about what politicians think about public opinion, which is often, in the short term more important. The other point I just wanted to make is that I think that there's a real tension sometimes between short run and long run objectives, and I think this comes to the point which Glenn made, but is also relevant to the point about humanitarian aid. That sometimes the communication messages which are most effective in the short term actually are counterproductive in the long term, and there's just some really difficult strategic trade-offs there. I mean, I think from our work, that the shadow of Live Aid is worth emphasising. It had a huge impact. It was hugely successful on its own terms at the time, but it's still shaping debate. And I think it will remain to be seen whether Make Poverty History casts a similar shadow and exactly what the nature of that long-term impact is. But I think it's worth everybody who's thinking about campaigns and communications to try and think about some of those trade-offs. And I think there are perhaps particular responsibilities on people in the humanitarian space, because we know that the public don't distinguish between humanitarian and development. So actually the messages which people hear on the humanitarian side are then applied. I mean, this whole point about teaching a man to fish, I mean, it sounds trite to people who work in the business, but that's still, the public still think we're giving people fish, I mean, in that metaphor. So, you've got to be careful about reinforcing that. I mean, I'm afraid our work doesn't go into enough to talk about sources of information in different groups and so forth, but I mean, I think some of the stuff that's been said already picks that up.
Brilliant. We've got time for sorry.
No, you go.
One more round of questions, and I'm afraid that's it. Sorry, one over here, one over here, and anyone else? One over there. Thank you.
My name is Najat Al-Said. I'm a PhD researcher at University of Westminster. I just want to highlight Joe's point that how, even though with the spread of social media, how television is so important. My whole research is about Arab satellite television and development in the Arab world. And what I'm trying to highlight in my research, the lack of development programs and aids regarding development. But on the even when I'm trying to, I couldn't even see there's a kind of lack of programs even in the Western media. Like if we watch like television, any Western television, whether American or British, I haven't really seen that programs regarding development that could be really a big influence on public opinions. So is there like kind of lack between cooperation or a partnership between development organizations and broadcasting mainly? That's my main focus.
Thank you.
I'm Mark Galloway, Director of IBT, the International Broadcasting Trust. I'd like to pick up this point about television. We've done a lot of research in this area. I want to make a very simple point which picks up actually on Sarah's point about humanitarian aid. And also Ben's point about being proactive. We as a sector need to be much more strategic about how we engage with television. And actually it's not programs about development, because they're only watched by people who are already interested in development. Sorry, they don't matter to the wider public. The people that we want to reach watch the news. So we have to think much more carefully about when we're interviewed on television news, what we say. And again, Ben said this point that media has the power. We don't necessarily have the power. We do have the power, actually. We're a lot more powerful than we think. And we need to start setting the agenda, not always respond to the agenda that news broadcasters set for us. And there's a key moment when there's a humanitarian crisis, when the ball is in our court. The DEC knows this only too well. They want us on air to talk about the crisis, whether it's Haiti or the Horn of Africa. And we have to use that moment to talk about context, causes, and talk about the process as you've identified, not simply talk immediately about that disaster. And I know the DC does a lot of fantastic work in terms of preparedness, and you publish these research reports after the event. But in that critical moment, when we're in the limelight, we need to frame our message much more carefully in the light of all the research that's been presented today.
Hi, Marta Foresti, ODI. Two quick thoughts. One is that I couldn't agree more with Sarah that there is an interaction here between political narrative and how that shapes actually public attitudes. And from that perspective, I wonder whether that's something that in the chess games that Jonathan was suggesting we could think about. This is an important strategic point to bear in mind. This is not about just taking the public along because public attitudes matter, but so that it interplays with what are the current political priorities and how that can be better influenced and shaped. On this debate about whether people are really up for more information about aid or not, I mean, I take the point that people don't want to read policy papers. But what I understood from this research ODI and IPPR have done is that people are not quite convinced by what they have heard thus far. So they might not want more, and they might not even want a lot more complexity, but they want something a bit different, and they want something that doesn't keep repeating the same messages, not quite ringing true. And on that front, and in the spirit of what else then could be, could we think about, I do wonder whether Sarah's suggestions about analogies with the UK and what happens here is something that we could be more harnessed, perhaps to break down some of the us and them barriers that seems to be so powerful. So a proposition of whether this is something that could be better explored.
Thanks very much. First, I'd actually just like to pick up on the point about how presenting the information in different formats to reach the media, at least. I think thank you. Well, the recent success of Poor Economics as a bestseller was mentioned as it won lots of awards from the Goldman Sachs and the Financial Times. It's sort of reaching another audience, the business audience perhaps, by being presenting it in a quite economic format, in the format of things like, obviously leaning on free economics. It shows that you can have a quite almost wonkish approach to aid and development, but there is an appetite for it in some ways. Anyway, I'd just like to pass that question on to other people.
I was just going to pick up on the point about what you quite rightly said about it's very important what you say. I would expand on that and say it's also important who says it and how they say it. And I know that perhaps goes without saying, but I thought I should say it nonetheless, because I think people, again, the average person in the street, though that's an expression I hate but use very often, the average person in the street has an idea about what an NGO spokesperson talking about a crisis will look like. They have an idea about what they will say and how they will say it. And you can be successful by playing against type. That will help and will be of benefit. And as we've said, television is hugely important and provides you with that opportunity to really deliver.
Thank you, Spencer.
I think we have to remember that most of us are fairly ignorant about most of the things that we express opinions about.
Absolutely.
Psychology sort of teaches us that what we tend to do in that situation, and that's most people when they're thinking about aid, is they tend to extrapolate, stereotype, use very simple decision rules. They tend to use information in the way it's presented to them. So you'll get a very different response if you say 50% of people are in favour as opposed to 50% of people are against, which is similar to, I think you were saying. And it just seems, because it was very interesting to me, when we did our work with the Mass Observation Facility, they're a totally biased sample of people. They think about things, they've been providing information. I'm going to look over here because we've all been looking that way the whole time. They provide lots of opinions about all sorts of things. We asked them about aid, and they went back to the same old stereotypes. Robert Mugabe was Africa. What they need is new stereotypes, more positive stereotypes. They need things. People are not going to spend lots of time looking into aid and development and thinking, but we all use those things as a basis for our opinions on the world. It's very difficult for people to come up with things. The average person, I always use my mother as an example, to actually come up with positive stereotypes. So she goes back to Robert Mugabe.
Thank you. Does anyone else like to pick up any of the points that have been raised about television or politics? Yeah, Ben.
Just a couple of points responding on the piece about kind of old media, if you like, and I find this all very reassuring as someone who's worked in communications for 25 years and feel, of course, all the digital media is terribly important, but good old kind of news coverage, I can agree with you more, is something we absolutely need to keep focused on. And of course, people receive it in all sorts of different ways, but it is still, and we might find this frightening in some cases, but it is still the predominant filter through which, particularly about these things, that because they don't. You can listen to the news about the NHS. Quite a lot of us also have an experience, so at least we have something else. We don't even have that, so even more so, it's important. So my point about was not saying we can't do anything about it because others shape it. What I was meaning was we ought to think strategically. Of course, our own direct communications, fundraising and so on are very important, absolutely, but I think sometimes we lose sight of the powerful influencers that we can have a kind of dialogue and think about our strategy with, and also the point about who delivers those. So, for example, it's an intelligent conversation with politicians and others, so that the messages that they are putting out on aid and development, not just what we're saying, or business or other third parties who are not, because to some extent we have to accept, it's like, well, NGOs, they would say that, wouldn't they? And we have some certain advantages, but we've got to get other people to say. So first thing is, couldn't agree more about the thing about focus on news and relentlessly coming back to that. Second point quickly is the point I think Jonathan and others talking about marshalling the arguments. And I do think this is something we as NGOs need to grapple with and think about the short and long term. Look, in a crisis, it's true that you can get certain messages in, but to some extent it's a crisis and you've got to talk about this crisis, otherwise you're not news, and that's going to be the Paddy knows this better. I'm sure there's hundreds of interviews where people have talked about what's the 30-second soundbite they use, it's the piece about the crisis. What we need to think about is about narratives on kind of events that are happening that aren't necessarily the crisis, where we can have a narrative. So the work that NGOs are doing on tax, for example, or other issues like that, which are in the mainstream there, and saying, you thought development was about people in a crisis. Actually, we got something here about tax, and there are other examples. So intelligent stuff that's newsworthy, but we can get up on it. And the last point, which we touched on, somebody touched on earlier, about behaviour and attitudes. I thought it was it was kind of slightly lost in all the other stuff. I think this is really important. If you look, there's some fantastic, really interesting detailed research looking at environmental attitudes, which I think development people need to look at, and what it showed. It really was very detailed research showing the ways in which particularly unconvinced people engaged in environmental issues. And what some of that showed, and I think we can learn from, is that, so putting it simply, there was a very interesting piece about the Sun campaign a little while ago about people getting to change their light bulbs over, and we were sort of a bit dismissive that light bulbs and that, it's like that's old news and stuff. Actually, what they studied was the fact that when people started using the different light bulbs, the more their attitudes on environmental issues where they wouldn't necessarily have been traditionally aligned, and people make a lot of stereotypes about sun readers, I just add in parentheses, but actually that helped them change that. And I think there have been parallels in things like in development, things like fair trade, for example, and others, where people start to take an action because they take an action. And we all come from a sort of academic intellectual training where you change your attitude, you think it all through, and then you go out and buy the light bulb or spend differently. Actually, often it works the other ways. And I think there's lots of empowering things. Glenn's point about how you empower people in quite small ways, people who are not in the core movement, and can say, I'm starting to do something. And through that, I start to think through and I have a conversation. I know it's not kind of straightforward, but I think that's something we need to think of other ways, because primarily, the action they take has been fundraising. So they give money. So it's not so surprising that an attitude follows. It's about that kind of giving mentality. So I think those are all kind of issues which can give us opportunities of tangible things we can do as NGOs, as kind of the wider development community, that we can help think through and develop to get back on the front foot on this.
Thanks very much, Ben. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So I'd just like to thank the panel for their contributions. So thank you, Sarah, Lenny, Ben, Joe, and Spencer. And thank you all for coming. It's been a really, really thought-provoking session. And the event's going to be online within 48 hours, so you can look at a recording and note down anything you missed.